The industry has not been slow to react, and it's no doubt driving an awful lot of this behaviour. And what we're seeing in the UK is an incredible blurring between activities that were once quite separate. So internet service providers are becoming TV platforms and purchasing their own TV rights. Broadcasters are offering services online, and they're launching their own platforms. Players with no history in the traditional broadcast industry at all are launching content services. Some offers look both like services, which provide a selection of content, like a TV channel does, but also a platform, offering a place for other people to put their content. Technologies offer access to internet-connected services as well as broadcast services, sometimes in a way where you just wouldn't know the difference if you were a consumer. Apps compete with linear EPGs. Backward EPGs we're seeing in the UK offer a different way to access catch-up content that looks like your existing EPG. And in amongst all of this, an increasing number of people are commissioning programme. I'm sure every single person on the planet has heard that Netflix commissioned House of Cards with Kevin Spacey. He's certainly been telling everybody all about it. This convergence means there's a pressing need to consider how the regulatory framework should develop in response to the changing technology underlying key platforms. The current scope of the regulatory framework is based around concepts like electronic communications networks and communication services. We need to consider whether that scope remains appropriate in light of the evolving technological landscape. And that can blur the distinction between regulatory boundaries, for example, in relation to transmission and content. Further discussion is needed about the scope of the framework for electronic communications in this context. And any new regulatory framework will need to be flexible enough to avoid regulation becoming quickly obsolete due to the speed of technological development. We're going to see this over the next decade or so. It needs to be clear and easily understood by the public. We're beginning to approach a stage, I think, where adding more incremental regulation onto existing regulation risks creating a system which is overly complex and therefore difficult to understand and difficult to implement. But that's a topic for another day, I think. So what does all this mean for content discovery and for the UK system of public service broadcasting, which I talked about earlier? Well, traditionally, with so few services available, navigation wasn't a problem. People had to physically get off their sofa to change the channel, and people relied on having a favourite channel or flicking between the channels to decide what they wanted to watch. Or they could use the printed Radio Times, a rather jolly picture. This was a weekly guide to all your television and radio services. But then the number of TV services increased and people had greater choice. Being aware of what was on at any given moment was increasingly difficult, so channels had to compete harder and harder for attention. And as choice grew, so navigation tools became more important, and people in the UK began to use electronic programme guides. A lot of them were quite simple. Some basic information about what's on now, what's on next, and the channel. In the UK, recognising the important role that public service broadcasters played in funding content and providing a wide range of programming, the government introduced a requirement for the PSB channels to be given prominence on programme guides like this, so at the top of the list in most cases. The intention was that as more and more households got multi-channel television, the PSB channels would remain really easy to find. And so those that were funded by advertising would continue to be well watched, have good advertising revenues, and so be able to invest in content. This in turn, people would watch it, reinforcing the advertising, a virtuous circle. And this approach was broadly successful as the PSBs and their portfolio channels continue to represent the majority of both viewing and investment in UK and EU content in the UK.